Pretty Lady, the words that silenced the church's cruel laughter. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. A widow entered a church in her old wedding dress and the town laughed. Only when a cowboy's daughter called her pretty did the laughter lose its sting. The steeple of Cedar Ridge Church cut into the gray Montana sky that November of 1885. Inside, Silver Creek's pews were crowded with townsfolk gathered to honor their dead sons, farmers turned soldiers, husbands buried beneath foreign soil. The last hymn drifted away like smoke, and silence pressed heavy as the door creaked open. Nora Hale stepped inside. She wore ivory satin, the dress she had once promised forever in. The fabric yellowed at the seams pulled tight across her full figure. In her gloved hands lay a single lily. Her steps echoed on the wood louder than the hymn had been. Whispers stirred instantly. "Is that a weddin' dress?" someone hissed. "Has she lost her mind?" A harsh laugh cracked from the back pew. "Who's going to call her pretty now?" Giggles rippled like needles sliding beneath her skin. Nora felt her chest clench, but she lifted her chin higher. She walked to the altar, where names of fallen men were pinned to wood. Kneeling, she placed the lily beneath the list. Once her husband James had kissed her hand here and called her his joy. Now only memory remained. She rose and turned back, heart racing, face flushed. The laughter hadn't faded. The sting clung like frost to her ribs. Outside, the air was colder still. Snow choked the steps, her boots crunching as she gripped the railing. Breath came quick and sharp. She hadn't noticed the man in the shadows. "I saw what they did," a voice said. Startled, she turned. Caleb Morgan leaned against a postcoat buttoned high hat pulled low. Still as stone, he didn't move closer. "I only wanted to honor him," Nora whispered. "You did." His voice was gravel-edged with kindness. "They laughed," she said. "They always do. They don't know better." He pulled a folded handkerchief from his coat and held it out. No pity, no sermon, just an offering. She hesitated, then took it. "Why do you care?" "Because people in mourning deserve respect, especially when the world forgets." Something broke loose inside her at that. For the first time since stepping into the dress, she felt seen. "I thought maybe wearing it would remind them I was once loved," she murmured. "It reminded me," Caleb said quietly. He tipped his hat, then turned toward the steps. Snow swirled between them, carrying away the sting of church laughter. He paused. "I run Sagebrush Hollow north of town. Quiet place, too much work for one man. I've been looking for help. Someone steady, someone my little girl can count on." Nora blinked. "You want to hire me? I want to offer you a job." His eyes met hers. "You didn't run when they mocked you. That matters. And my daughter needs someone kind. But I'm not. Look at me. People laugh. I'm not hiring pretty," he said. Then softer, "though I wouldn't say you aren't." Heat climbed her neck. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes." Her lips trembled. "Unless this is pity. I don't pity anyone who works hard and keeps her head high. I need help. You need a place. That's all." Before she could answer, a small voice piped up. "Daddy!" A little girl bounded across the snow curls flying from beneath a cap, cheeks flushed. She stopped before Nora, eyes wide. "Pretty lady," she announced, tugging the hem of satin. Nora froze. The words cracked something open inside her, something buried under years of mockery. She crouched stiffly. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Maddie, the child, said proudly. "She doesn't talk much to strangers," Caleb muttered. "She's not a stranger," Maddie declared. Then, looking up at him, "Can she come home with us?" That depends on the lady, Caleb said evenly. Nora glanced between father and daughter. I can't cook much. I burn tea. I fold sheets wrong. I don't drink tea, Caleb replied, and Maddie sleeps in a nest of quilts anyhow. To her surprise, Nora laughed, light, almost girlish. She looked back toward the church, its walls still holding whispers sharp enough to scar. Then she turned to the road north, a ribbon of white stretching into unknown silence. All right. Caleb's nod was solemn as though a contract had been sealed. Maddie jumped in delight. Yea, pretty lady is comin'. They set off together, Maddie skipping ahead, Caleb steady beside Nora. Snow squeaked beneath their boots. Behind them, Cedar Ridge Church loomed with its steeple stabbing a sky already dimming toward night. Ahead lay Sagebrush Hollow, a place Nora had never seen, but which for the first time in years felt like direction instead of escape. She tucked the handkerchief into her pocket. The wind combed through cottonwoods, carrying away fragments of laughter she refused to take with her. Each crunch of the wagon wheels in snow marked a line of separation between what she had been and what might still be. For the first time since James's passing, she wasn't walking back into emptiness. She was leaving it behind. The road to Sagebrush Hollow cut through white fields where fences stood half buried in snow. The wagon creaked beneath Caleb's steady hand on the reins. Maddie hummed beside Nora, swinging her legs oblivious to the cold or the weight in the air. Nora sat stiff, her gloved fingers twisted together in her lap. She had said yes, but doubt clung like frost to her bones. By the time the horses pulled up the long drive, the afternoon had collapsed into dusk. Sagebrush Hollow revealed itself as a weather-worn ranch house with a wide porch and a barn crouched against the hills. Smoke curled from the chimney. The windows glowed faintly warm against the coming dark. To Nora, it looked less like a home, and more like a test she was sure to fail. Inside, Maddie darted from room to room, showing off a tangle of quilts on her bed, the stone hearth in the front room, the shelf where she kept her crude drawings. Nora tried to smile, tried to memorize the way joy spilled so easily from the girl's lips. Caleb simply carried in her small satchel and left it by the door of the spare bedroom without comment. He didn't hover. He didn't explain. His silence left space that was heavier than any words. The first morning, Nora rose early, determined not to disappoint. She scrubbed tin plates in cold water until her hands stung. She tried to sweep the floor, but the broom snagged on loose boards and raised more dust than it cleared. When she tried boiling water for tea, she left it too long. By noon, she had cracked a bowl overcooked porridge and spilled half a bucket of wash. Each mistake stacked higher than the last, pressing against her chest. When Caleb appeared in the doorway, she braced for judgment. He set down a bucket by the stove. Steam rose from inside. Hot water, he said simply, then turned back toward the barn. No sigh, no correction, just the quiet gift. Nora stared after him, her throat tight. No man had ever answered failure with something as simple as help. That evening, Maddie sat cross-legged on the rug, scribbling furiously on brown paper with a dull pencil. She glanced up at Nora. "Hold still," she said. Nora blinked. A few minutes later, Maddie held up her drawing, a crooked oval face, wild curls a dress with lopsided flowers. "It's you." "Pretty lady." Nora's throat burned. She crouched down. "That's very kind." Maddie jumped up and ran to Caleb, holding out the drawing. "Look, Daddy." Caleb took the paper carefully, eyes lingering on the smile Maddie had sketched onto the round face. He folded it and slipped it into his vest pocket. He didn't look at Nora, but the gesture spoke louder than words. That night, Nora found a folded towel on her bed still warm from the stove with a piece of hard candy resting on top. No note. Just kindness left like a secret. She sat on the edge of the bed holding the candy in her palm, wondering if this house had more room for her than she dared to hope. The days grew into a rhythm, awkward but steady. Nora cooked stew that burned at the edges, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, hung sheets too tight on Maddie's bed. Each time she braced for criticism. Each time Caleb said nothing, only continued with his work or left behind some small token, a bucket of water, a folded cloth, a fresh nail hammered into a sagging shelf. Then came the morning that shattered the fragile calm. Maddie's laughter rang from the pasture, sharp as a bell. Nora turned to see the girl standing beyond the fence, tiny boots planted in frost-stiff grass. Just yards away, a silver-gray Mustang pawed the earth head, tossing muscles restless. Nora's heart lurched. "No!" she shouted, running, before thought could catch her. Skirts tangled around her legs as she vaulted the fence. The horse's ears pinned back, its body coiled to charge. Maddie froze. Nora threw herself forward, scooping the child into her arms and twisting to shield her as hooves thundered past. Dirt and snow flew. A scream tore from her throat. Then arms closed around them, Caleb's arms pulling them both through the fence as the horse veered off with a snort. They collapsed into the snow. Maddie sobbed into Nora's shoulder. Nora trembled from head to toe, her lungs dragging in jagged breaths. Caleb crouched beside them, face pale, chest heaving. He brushed a hand over Maddie's curls, then looked at Nora. "You didn't even hesitate," he said quietly. She was out there alone. Nora whispered, still clutching Maddie. "I didn't care about myself." For a moment, silence hung thick. Caleb's gaze lingered not on her clumsiness, not on the dress she still sometimes felt trapped in, but on the way she held his daughter like something sacred. His voice was softer when he spoke again. "You're more important than you think, Nora." That night, Nora returned to her room to find something on her pillow, a small wooden comb smooth polished a tiny heart carved into its handle. No words, no explanation, just a gift. She picked it up slowly, her fingers tracing the grooves her throat tight. No one had ever thanked her without demanding something in return. In the quiet of Sagebrush Hollow, with Maddie's laughter drifting down the hall and Caleb's footsteps fading toward the barn, Nora realized the truth. These walls didn't see her as a burden. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For the first time in years, she dared to believe she might belong. The calm at Sagebrush Hollow did not last long. Nora began to feel steady in her routines. Burnt stew aside, Maddie's laughter filled the cabin, and Caleb's quiet nods gave her more reassurance than words ever could. But towns whisper the way wind cuts through canyon walls, and Nora's past was never far behind. It began in the general store. Nora had gone for Flower Cheek's pink from the cold shawl wrapped taut. As she stood in line, she felt the air shift. A couple of women leaned close, voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "That's her," one said. "The one who wore a wedding dress to a funeral service." Another smirked. "I heard she was run out of Copper Ridge, caught the eye of the Langley boy and didn't know when to quit." The words clung to Nora like burrs. She kept her chin high, but inside her stomach knotted. When she left the store, she gripped the basket so tightly the handle bit her palms. A familiar voice cut through the wind. "Well, if it isn't the belle of the scandal." Nora froze. A man stood near the hitching rail, tall, polished, wrapped in a coat finer than any rancher's. His pale eyes gleamed with a cruelty she remembered too well. Victor Langley. "I didn't expect to find you this far out," he said, stepping closer. You always did have a habit of disappearing." Her throat went dry. "Why are you here?" "I heard whispers about a woman with a stained name," he said smoothly. "Had to see if they were true." She tightened her grip on the basket. "I don't want anything from you, but you do," he purred. "Your name is still dirt in Copper Ridge, a stain that won't wash out. I could change that. A few letters, a kind word to the right people. Imagine walking into a church without hearing laughter." Bile rose in her throat. "In exchange for what?" He smiled with all teeth. "For finishing what you started." The slap came before she thought. Her palm stung and his head jerked back. Shock flashed across his face, quickly replaced by rage. "You ruined me." Nora spat, her voice shaking but strong. "And now you think I'd let you own me again." "I gave you a way out," he snarled. "I made you matter." A deeper voice cut in steady as thunder. "She already does." Victor turned. Caleb stood just beyond the gate arms, crossed jaw tight. He walked forward with the kind of calm that made men wary. "This is between us," Victor said sharply. "No," Caleb replied, his tone low. "You made it about the town when you branded her with lies, and you made it mine when you showed up here thinking she was still defenseless." Victor sneered. "She has a reputation." Caleb stepped closer until they stood nearly toe-to-toe. "You think honor is something you assign. You don't get to decide her worth." Victor's nostrils flared. "You don't know what she did. I know she wakes before dawn. I know she works until her hands are raw. I know she threw herself in front of a wild horse for my daughter." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "And I know there's not a shred of her that needs your permission to be whole." Victor faltered, but pride kept his chin high. Caleb finally looked past him to Nora. "You all right?" Her eyes burned, but she nodded. Victor scoffed, adjusting his collar. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it," Caleb muttered and opened the gate. Victor turned on his heel and disappeared into the wind. For a long moment, Nora stood frozen, the basket trembling in her hands. Caleb's eyes met hers. "You never have to answer for who you were," he said quietly, "only for who you are." That night, the whispers in town shifted. They still spoke her name, but with new tones. She must have mattered for Caleb Morgan to defend her. Maybe we had her wrong. She risked her life for that child. Respect, like trust, wasn't bought. But sometimes it began with one man willing to stand at the gate and say enough. At Sagebrush Hollow, the fire crackled warm. Maddie sprawled on the rug with her pencils. Caleb mended tack by the hearth. And Nora, for the first time in years, allowed herself to breathe without waiting for the weight of shame to fall. Still, as the night stretched quiet around her, doubt lingered. The town's whispers could turn again. Victor might not be finished. And she wondered not for the first time if Caleb's kindness was born of need or something deeper. Winter deepened around Sagebrush Hollow each dawn, breaking cold and brittle. Nora had settled into the rhythm of ranch life, sweeping floors, cooking meals that often burned, and mending clothes by the stove. Maddie trailed her like a shadow, eager to help her little hands tugging at fabric or bringing scraps of wood for the fire. Caleb remained steady as ever, never speaking much, but always present, leaving small kindnesses like buckets of hot water or nails driven into loose planks. For a while, Nora believed she had finally outrun the whispers, but small towns seldom let go of gossip, and doubt has a way of slipping in through cracks. One evening, as she dried tin cups in the kitchen, voices drifted in from the porch. The wind carried them clear through the frosted glass. "Your daughter needs stability," said Reverend Whitcomb, the pastor of Silver Creek. His tone was firm, almost scolding. "A home should have a mother as well as a father." You've grieved long enough, Caleb. Maddie deserves better than a house kept by a woman like that." The words struck Nora like a blow. Her hands froze on the cup breath catching in her throat. Then Caleb's voice calm, but certain I don't need another wife. "I asked her to stay because I needed help with Maddie. She's done more than anyone expected. That's all." Nora felt the cup slip from her fingers into the basin with a clatter. She barely noticed. "That's all." The words echoed in her chest like a bell struck hard. To him, she was only a placeholder, help not heart, not someone to fight for. That night, when the house was quiet, Nora sat on the edge of her bed. The wooden comb Caleb had given her lay on the nightstand. She stared at it for a long time before tucking it into her satchel, along with the shawl and a few belongings. She packed lightly, as though she planned only to vanish, not to be remembered. She whispered toward Maddie's room. "She'll forget me. Children do." Then she slipped out into the storm. Snow whipped against her face, the world a blur of white and shadow. Each step crunched into the frozen earth, heavy with shame and loss. But upstairs, Maddie stirred. Her small bed felt too empty, too quiet. She padded across the hall to Nora's room, pushed open the door, and found it bare. The bed made the shawl gone, the comb missing. Panic bloomed in her chest. "No," she whispered, "she wouldn't leave me." Grabbing her coat, Maddie rushed outside, calling into the storm. "Nora, Nora." Her voice was swallowed by the wind. Small boots stumbled through snowdrifts past the barn into the fields where the moonlight shimmered against endless white. When Caleb found her bed empty, terror gripped him. He tore through the cabin, then out the door shouting both their names. Lantern light cut through the storm as neighbors joined the search torches bobbing across the ridge. Nora staggered through the gale lantern, swinging wildly in her hand. "Maddie," she cried, voice hoarse. The cold bit through wool and bone. Each step grew heavier, each breath more ragged. Then, beneath a pine weighed down with snow, she saw a small, still shape. Her heart stopped. Dropping the lantern, she lunged forward, knees striking hard. Maddie. She gathered the child into her arms. The girl's limbs were stiff with cold, her cheeks, blotched eyes fluttering. "Shh, it's all right," Nora whispered, rocking her fiercely. "I've got you, my darling. I won't let go." Maddie clung to her coat, sobbing weakly. "I thought you left forever." Nora's throat ached. "I thought I should." "Don't," Maddie whispered. "You make my daddy smile again." The words hit like lightning, cutting clean through her doubt. Then came the sound of boots pounding across snow. Lantern light broke through the trees, and there was Caleb, breath-heaving snow clinging to his beard and coat. His eyes locked onto them. He dropped the lantern and fell to his knees, arms wrapping around both of them in a trembling hold. Thank God, he breathed, pressing his forehead to Nora's shoulder again and again. Thank God. For a long time they knelt there, three figures bound together against the storm. Finally, Caleb drew back his eyes raw and unguarded. "I never meant what you thought you heard," he said softly. "I didn't say I didn't want you. I said I didn't need another wife because—" His voice broke, then steadied. "Because I already found someone who made this house a home." Nora's lips parted, but words failed. Tears burned her eyes. "I didn't save you, Nora," he continued, voice rough with truth. "I watched you rise from ashes, and I realized I wanted to walk beside someone who could do that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver ring, worn but clean. Snow glistened on its surface as he held it between them. "Will you marry me not out of need, but because I choose you?" Maddie nestled against Nora's chest, lifted her damp lashes, and whispered, "Say yes." And through years of shame, through nights of silence and doubts that had clawed her heart raw, Nora nodded. Spring came slow to Montana, but when it arrived, the land around Sagebrush Hollow seemed to breathe again. Snow gave way to green shoots along the pasture fence. The creek behind the barn broke loose from its icy silence and gurgled across the rocks. For Nora, it felt like waking after years of holding her breath. The wedding was held beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the pasture, where the land sloped down toward the valley, and the sky always seemed a little closer. There were no polished pews or gilded chandeliers, just wooden benches, mason jars of wildflowers, and neighbors gathered in plain clothes. Children darted between the rows, laughter mixing with the soft rustle of grass. Nora wore a simple cream dress she had stitched herself by lamplight, the needle steady in her hands, even when her heart was not. It wasn't satin, it wasn't grand, but it was hers. Maddie, solemn and proud, carried a bouquet with both hands, her braids tied with ribbons. Caleb stood steady at the front, his dark coat brushed but not new, his smile anchored like the land he worked. When Nora reached him, her fingers trembled. Caleb took her hands in his, steadying them with the same quiet strength he'd shown since the day she stepped out of the church and found him waiting. His "I do" landed with weight, not born of impulse, but of a promise forged in silence and storms. When the vows were done, the townsfolk didn't rush to leave. They lingered, sharing pies and jugs of spiced cider, the air filled with laughter, free of cruelty for once. Some whispered still, but their words had changed. Respect had replaced ridicule. And for the first time, Silver Creek felt less like a jury and more like a community willing to see her as whole. At night, when the last guest had gone, Caleb stoked the fire while Maddie fell asleep tangled in her quilts. Nora sat by the window, watching lanterns wink out across the valley. She thought of the woman who had entered a church in an old wedding dress and left in shame. That woman still lived inside her, but she wasn't alone anymore. Weeks passed. The air softened, carrying scents of sage and damp earth. One morning, Nora awoke to the sound of hammering outside. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped onto the porch barefoot. Caleb stood by the barn, sweat shining on his brow, a frame of cedar beams rising beside him. "What's this?" she asked. He straightened, grinning. "A room. For you. For me." He nodded, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Faces east toward the valley. You turned this place back into a home. Thought it was time you had a space of your own." Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak, so she only nodded, tears hot against the morning chill. By spring's end, the room was finished. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books Caleb had bartered for in town. A desk sat beneath a wide window, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. Nora found herself drawn there in the evenings, sitting quietly with paper and pencil sketching lessons or writing down fragments of thoughts she'd long kept buried. Word spread across the hills. By summer, children from nearby farms gathered on the porch, wide-eyed and eager, their fingers stained with ink. Maddie sat proudly among them, tongue caught between her teeth as she traced letters. Nora taught them to read, to count, to believe their voices mattered. Sometimes, as she taught, Caleb leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with a softness that said more than words ever could. He had built her a room, but she had filled it with life. One evening, after the last child had left, Nora sat at her desk, the wooden comb resting beside her papers. She picked it up, thumb brushing over the carved heart. She remembered the night she thought it was a farewell gift, the night she almost left for good. Now it sat here as proof of something steadier than she had dared to dream. Outside, Maddie chased fireflies through tall grass, her laughter ringing against the barn walls. Caleb's voice called gently after her, low and steady. Nora closed her eyes, letting the sound sink deep. She whispered to herself, "I thought I had to be beautiful to be loved, but being loved made me beautiful." The lesson had taken years' storms and scars. In a world that once only measured her by whispers and mockery, she had found a family who saw beyond all that. And to anyone listening, her story carried a message: you are not defined by the cruelty of others. Respect cannot be stolen by laughter, and dignity cannot be erased by lies. Sometimes it only takes one person who refuses to look away, one child who calls you pretty without hesitation, one steady hand that says, "I choose you." If this story touched your heart, share it in the comments. Tell us if you've ever been seen when the world tried to make you invisible. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, resilience, and second chances. Out here on the edge of the frontier, hearts still find their way home.